213 BC. A man dropped dead on a mountainside in northern China. He was not a soldier. He was not a criminal. He was a farmer, torn from his family by imperial order, forced to carry stones up a frozen ridge until his body gave out. No one stopped to bury him. They built the wall on top of him. That was not an accident. That was the plan. Over 400,000 people died building the Great Wall of China. Some historians believe the number is closer to 1 million. Their bones were not removed from the construction site. They were not buried beside the wall. They were used as fill material inside the wall itself, compressed between layers of earth and stone, entombed inside the very structure they had been forced to create. And for over 2,000 years, no official record acknowledged it. Most people think the Great Wall is one of humanity's greatest achievements. They are wrong. It is one of humanity's greatest mass graves. And the empire that built it spent centuries making sure you would never know that. This is what they hid. This is what the stones remember. To understand why the wall was built on human bones, you have to understand the man who ordered it. You have to understand what kind of mind looks at a mountain range and sees not an obstacle, but a weapon. You have to understand what it means to rule an empire and believe, completely, that your existence is more important than the existence of every other human being alive. His name was Meng Jiangnu. He came to power at the age of 13. He was a child sitting on a throne surrounded by advisors, rivals, and men who wanted him dead before he was old enough to be dangerous. He survived all of them. He did more than survive. By the time he was 38 years old, he had conquered 6 rival kingdoms that had been at war with each other for over 2 centuries. He had unified China for the first time in recorded history, and he had declared himself Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor, a title he invented himself because no existing title was large enough for what he believed he had become. He was brilliant. He was methodical. He standardized weights and measures across the entire empire so that commerce could function across regions that had previously used incompatible systems. He standardized the written script so that people across thousands of kilometers could communicate in a common language. He built roads. He built canals. He created the administrative infrastructure of a modern state 2,000 years before the concept existed. And he was absolutely convinced that he was immortal. Not metaphorically. Literally. Qin Shi Huang sent ships across the ocean searching for islands where the elixir of eternal life was said to be kept by immortal beings. He sent delegations to every corner of the known world consulting alchemists and mystics. He consumed mercury-based compounds that his court physicians told him would purify his blood and extend his life indefinitely. Compounds that modern toxicologists believe were slowly destroying his nervous system and his mind. The paranoia that intensified in the final years of his reign, the executions of advisors who disagreed with him, the burning of books, the entombment of scholars alive. These behaviors are consistent with mercury poisoning. The man who built the wall may have been, in his final years, going mad from the medicine he took to live forever. When he decided to build a wall across the entire northern frontier of his empire, he did not convene a committee. He did not request a feasibility study. He gave the order. The wall would run from the eastern sea to the western desert, sealing the northern boundary of China against the nomadic tribes that had raided the frontier for generations. It would be built immediately. It would be built at any cost. The number that came back to the imperial administration was staggering. The wall would need to stretch over 13,000 li, roughly 5,000 kilometers, across terrain that included some of the most inaccessible mountain ranges in the world. It would require simultaneous labor on dozens of separate sections, coordinated across distances that took weeks to travel. There was no supply infrastructure in most of the construction zone. There were no roads into the northern mountain territories. Getting food to the workers would be almost as difficult as building the wall itself. None of that changed the order. Between 300,000 and 500,000 laborers worked on the wall simultaneously at the peak of construction. They came from every province of the empire. Peasant farmers who had never traveled more than a day's walk from their home villages were given 3 days' notice and marched north under military escort. Convicted criminals serving sentences for offenses ranging from theft to political dissent were transported in chains and assigned to the most dangerous sections. Soldiers from the 6 conquered kingdoms, Men who had fought against the Qin army and lost were given a choice between execution and forced labor. Most of them chose labor. Many of them died anyway. And then there were the scholars. Qin Shi Huang had declared war on history itself. He ordered the burning of every text that preserved the memory of the kingdoms he had destroyed, every philosophical work that questioned imperial authority, every poem and song that belonged to a cultural tradition he wanted erased. The scholars who had spent their lives preserving, copying, and teaching from those texts were given the same choice as the conquered soldiers. Many of them chose labor on the wall, believing they might survive it. Most did not. They died carrying stone on mountain ridges, their knowledge unrecoverable, their names unrecorded, buried inside the structure that replaced the civilization they had tried to preserve. The workers received almost nothing. This is not an exaggeration for dramatic effect. The imperial logistics system calculated rations at the level required to maintain physical movement, not at the level required to maintain health or body weight under sustained heavy labor in extreme conditions. Workers who arrived at the construction sites in reasonable physical condition began losing weight within weeks. Within 2 months, most of them were operating on starvation-level energy. Their bodies began consuming muscle mass to keep the organs functioning. Men who had been physically strong when they were conscripted became hollow versions of themselves within a single season. Clothing was not provided. This detail is important because most of the construction occurred in the northern territories, where winter temperatures dropped to levels that kill unprepared people within hours of exposure. Workers who were conscripted in summer and arrived at the construction site before the first cold weather had no protection when the temperature dropped. Families in the southern provinces sometimes rushed winter clothing north when they received notification that their son or husband had been taken. But the distances were enormous, and the imperial postal routes were not designed for civilian traffic. By the time a package arrived at the correct section of the construction site, weeks or months after being sent, the person it was intended for might already be dead. The foreman had quotas. This is the mechanism that explains everything about how the construction operated and everything about why so many people died. Each foreman was responsible for a specific number of linear meters of wall per week. If that number was not achieved, the foreman was punished. If a foreman was punished repeatedly, he lost his status and became a laborer himself. This created a system of absolute downward pressure at every level. The foreman pushed the workers. The workers had no choice but to comply or face punishment. When a worker died, the foreman's quota did not decrease to account for the reduced workforce. The remaining workers were required to maintain the same output with fewer people. This meant every death made the surviving workers' situation worse. Letters survive. This is one of the most devastating facts about the construction of the wall. Archaeologists excavating sites along the construction route have recovered correspondence that was preserved in dry conditions for over 2,000 years. Most of these letters are not personal communications in any meaningful sense. They are requests. Send me shoes. The ones I have are destroyed. Send me a coat that will last the winter. Send me food that does not spoil on the journey. Tell my wife that I am alive. Tell my children that I think about them. Tell my parents that I am sorry. The handwriting on many of these letters is unsteady. The men who wrote them were already weakened, their hands already trembling from exhaustion and cold. Some of the letters were never finished. They stopped mid-sentence, the brush dropped or set aside and never picked up again. The families who received these letters, if they received them at all, were left in a condition that the empire neither acknowledged nor addressed. A wife in a village in southern China who received a letter from her husband saying he was alive had no way to know whether he was still alive by the time the letter arrived. She had no way to send a response that she could be certain would reach him. She had no way to know when he would return, or whether he would return, or whether the next letter she received would be a letter at all, or simply silence extending forward into years that offered no resolution. Many families received nothing. Not a letter. Not a notification of death. Not a return of remains. The man was taken, and then he was gone, and the empire moved on to the next quota. Here is what most people do not know about what the wall is actually made of. The visible exterior of the Great Wall, The dressed stone facing that appears in every photograph creates an impression of solid masonry construction throughout. That impression is false. The exterior is stone. But the core of the wall, the interior mass that constitutes the majority of its volume and provides its structural weight, is compacted earth, gravel, rubble, and organic material. In the original Qin dynasty sections, the construction method was a technique called hangtu, compressed earth construction. Workers stood in the trench shoulder to shoulder, lifting heavy wooden rammers and driving them down into loose fill in a coordinated rhythm, compacting each layer until it reached the density of solid ground before the next layer was added. The rammers weighed between 10 and 20 kilograms. The work continued for hours without stopping. The vibration traveled up through the wooden handles into the workers' arms and shoulders and necks, hour after hour, day after day, week after week, until the joints swelled and the hands could no longer fully close. Archaeological surveys conducted during the 20th century found human skeletal remains embedded inside sections of the wall, not buried beside the wall, not interred in cemetery sites adjacent to the construction zone, inside the wall, within the compacted fill layers. The bones were found in positions consistent with a complete body having been present when a fill layer was added, then covered by subsequent compacted layers as the construction continued upward, the body left in place within the rising structure. This finding matches what the ancient texts had been saying for centuries. A Chinese legend, recorded in multiple versions across the 2,000 years since the wall was built, tells the story of a woman named Meng Jiangnu, whose husband, Fan Shiliang, was conscripted to build the wall and never came home. She spent months preparing warm winter clothing for him. She walked the entire length of the northern frontier searching for him. At every garrison she stopped, she was told he had been sent to the next section. At every watchtower, she was directed further ahead. When she finally reached the section where her husband had worked, she was told he had died weeks or months earlier. She sat down at the base of the wall and she wept. She wept for days without stopping. The legend says her grief was so absolute and so pure that the wall itself responded to it. A section collapsed, the stones falling away to reveal the fill material within, and within the fill, the bones of the dead. Among those bones, she identified her husband. The story was classified as folklore for generations, a myth constructed to give emotional shape to loss, a legend that told people what they needed to hear, rather than what was true. Modern excavations suggest it was a historical account, written in the only form that could survive imperial censorship. The engineering of the wall was, separately from everything else, genuinely extraordinary. The wall was not a single barrier. It was a coordinated defensive system of a sophistication that had no parallel in the ancient world. Watchtowers were positioned at mathematically precise intervals so that the signal fire of each tower was visible from the next tower in both directions. Even in fog and heavy weather, a warning signal could travel 5,000 kilometers in under 1 hour using this relay system, faster than any cavalry messenger could cover a fraction of that distance. The road surface along the top of the wall was engineered wide enough for 5 fully armored soldiers to march abreast, or for cavalry units to move at a canter, making the wall itself a highway for rapid military repositioning along the entire frontier. Drainage channels cut into the walkway surface at regular intervals directed rainwater off the road and down the exterior face of the wall, protecting the compacted fill from water infiltration. Those drainage channels still function in surviving sections today, over 2,000 years after they were cut. But there are sections of the wall that run along vertical cliff faces where no natural surface existed to build on. The wall was constructed on those sections by workers suspended from hemp ropes, anchored with wooden stakes driven into cracks in the rock face, cutting footholds into vertical stone while hanging in open air hundreds of meters above the valleys below. The hemp ropes were manufactured to a consistent standard, but hemp is an organic material and it degrades under tension and exposure. The wooden stakes were driven into whatever cracks the rock presented, and their holding strength was never consistent. When a rope failed or an anchor pulled free under the weight of a struggling worker, that worker fell the full distance to the valley floor. There is no record of how many fell. The imperial administration recorded meters of wall completed per section per week. The deaths that produced those meters were not considered data worth preserving. The wall was never finished. Qin Shi Huang died in 210 BC, 3 years after the major construction drive began, while traveling on an inspection tour of the eastern provinces. His death was concealed by his closest advisors for weeks. They traveled with his sealed carriage, issuing orders in his name, pretending he was merely resting, because they understood that the moment his death became known, the empire would begin to fracture. They were right. The succession crisis that followed his death became a civil war within 2 years. The Qin dynasty, which the first emperor had named to last 10,000 generations, collapsed entirely within 4 years of his death. The construction of the wall, the project that had consumed hundreds of thousands of lives, was abandoned mid-process. Sections that had been under active construction were left incomplete, scaffolding rotting in place. The garrisoned sections were evacuated as the military resources were redirected to the civil war. The northern frontier went undefended. The nomadic Xiongnu, the people the wall had been built to stop, rode through the gaps without resistance. Later dynasties rebuilt portions of the wall when they had the resources and the political will to do so. The Han dynasty reinforced certain strategic sections, but the continuous imperial investment required to maintain the entire structure never materialized again in the same form. Most of the original Qin wall fell into disrepair over the following centuries, overgrown, collapsed in sections, quarried by local populations who removed the dressed stone facing for their own construction. The earthen core, no longer protected by its stone facing, eroded. In some areas it became a low ridge, barely distinguishable from natural terrain. In others, it disappeared entirely back into the landscape it had been extracted from. The wall that exists today, the wall in every photograph, the wall printed on currency and featured in films and climbed by tens of millions of tourists every year, is primarily a Ming dynasty structure. The Ming rulers who came to power in 1368 faced the same northern threat that Qin Shi Huang had faced 17 centuries earlier, and made the same fundamental decision. They used kiln-fired brick rather than compacted earth, which produced a harder and more weather-resistant structure. They designed larger and better provisioned watchtowers. They extended the wall into territories the Qin version had never reached. The Ming wall was built to last, and it has lasted. It is 1,400 years younger than the wall that contains the dead. What remains of the original Qin wall exists in eroded fragments across remote sections of northern China that receive almost no visitors. Low earthen mounds barely knee-height in some places, invisible at ground level in others. The bones inside those mounds have been in the earth for over 2,000 years. They are indistinguishable now from the soil surrounding them. They will never be individually identified. They will never be counted with precision. The number 400,000 is an estimate. The number 1 million is an estimate. The true number is sealed inside the wall and will remain there. Qin Shi Huang wanted to live forever. The dynasty lasted 4 years after his death. The wall outlasted the man who ordered it and the empire that built it and every dynasty that subsequently tried to claim it as a symbol of their own greatness. What the wall actually is, stripped of every imperial narrative layered onto it across 20 centuries, is the largest structure ever built by human hands, built partly out of those human hands, standing because of the people compressed inside it. The achievement belongs to them, not to the emperor, not to the administrators who ran the quota system, not to the historians who described forced labor as noble sacrifice, to the farmer taken from his village, to the scholar who owned the wrong books, to the worker hanging from a hemp rope on a cliff face with no choice and no way home. They are the wall. Without them, it does not stand. And somewhere inside those sealed foundations and compacted fill layers that have not been disturbed in over 2,000 years, someone is still waiting to be found. They have been waiting since 212 BC. They are still waiting now.